Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for what I am sure will be a very timely and interesting discussion of the emergence of the BRICS. For us at NUPI, emerging powers and BRICS has been an increasingly central research topic. It challenges us as scholars to re-examine some of our taken-for-granted assumptions about the international system. And for us internally, it's been an engine bringing our long-standing area studies focuses on Russia, South Africa, India, and China in conversation with our broader capacity on global governance. My name is Alana Wilson-Rove. I'm head of the research group on emerging powers and global development and a senior researcher here at NUPI. With us today to explore how the BRICS have gone from investment jargon and into something more, we are very honored to welcome Professor Ramesh Thakur. He is director of the Center for Nuclear Non-proliferation and Disarmament in the Crawford School at Australian National University. He has extensive experience from the policy world, and saying that he is a prolific academic author is really putting it quite mildly, with recent volumes on global governance in the UN, the responsibility to protect, understanding authority in the UN, nuclear weapons, and a forthcoming major work on modern diplomacy. He will be giving the bulk of the discussion today, and as his discussant, we have our very own Cedric de Koning, who is a senior research fellow at NUPI. He serves as special advisor to the head of the Peace Support Operations Division of the African Union Commission and has a main research focus on the African Union, the EU, and UN peacekeeping and peacebuilding. A recent important publication is where Cedric is co-editor, examines the BRICS in detail and forwards the notion that perhaps they are operating with a philosophy of coexistence, which hopefully Cedric will explore during his questions. We look forward, we'll save some time for questions, so once Cedric starts discussing, I'll be keeping an eye out in the audience, so just catch my attention if you'd like to get on the list. Thank you very much, and Professor Thakur.
Thanks, Ilana. Is this your coffee? No? It ain't mine. Well, it's always a pleasure to be back at NUPI, although I must say I prefer mid-year to this time of the year to come to this country, but I can't always have Canberra weather. If you remember, Francis Fukuyama famously proclaimed the end of history. And then Tom Friedman, with his argument about the world becoming flat, in effect proclaimed the end of geography. It seems to me that both history and geography are reasserting themselves with vengeance against the backdrop of a changing global power structure, with the BRICS in particular showing the self-confidence, motivation, and the capacity to shift from being simple rule takers to becoming norm shapers and perhaps even norm setters and norm enforcers. As we know, great powers rise and fall on the tide of history. The process of transition is not always peaceful or linear, but often jagged with points of friction. We lack the analytical tools to be able to map power transitions with any degree of confidence while it's actually occurring. Seems pretty obvious decades on, but not while it's happening. As the old and new powers cross each other on the way down and up, they create potential zones of tension and conflict. A declining power may fail to recognize or refuse to accept its fading economic dominance, military might, and diplomatic clout, persist in demanding respect due to its former status, and try to make the rising power pay for its perceived lack of respect. So pay us the respect due to us, or we'll make you pay for your lack of respect. Conversely, the rising, but not yet fully risen power may exaggerate the scale and pace of its declining rival's fall. Consider the China-US equation in the contested maritime environment of Asia-Pacific. In recent years, Beijing has adopted a markedly more aggressive posture vis-à-vis territorial and maritime disputes with Japan, Vietnam, Philippines. The US is unlikely to risk full-fledged confrontation with China over relatively small and minor incidents like a Vietnamese boat sunk, a submerged reef captured, or an uninhabited rocky island contested. But each probe tests the patience and resolve of the regional country and gradually increases skepticism about the reliability of the US security option. In other words, Washington is in no position to challenge Beijing on every provocation. But each provocation that goes unchallenged improves China's leverage over its neighbors and weakens America's standing in the region. Now, of course, Westerners may believe that the growing integration and interdependence of China with the regional and international economy makes armed conflict too costly to contemplate, and that the Pacific military balance is so heavily in US favor that China would not be foolish enough to challenge Washington. But what if Beijing believes that the costs to Washington would be so high that the US would back down? Along many such misperceptions and miscalculations do the bloody rivers of human history flow into the ocean of oblivion for once great powers. Short of armed conflict, the struggle for power can also occur over the capacity to write and enforce the rules, norms, and laws that govern international relations, including over access to markets and resources. My talk proceeds in 5 parts. I'll discuss first the southwards shift in wealth, power, and influence. Then I'll show how the BRICS grouping symbolizes the shift. In the 3rd and 4th sections, I'll examine their impact on global economic governance and geopolitical orders. And finally, I'll comment on their lack of unity and coherence. From 1000 to 1800 AD, roughly, Asia, Africa, and Latin America accounted for between 65 to 75% of global population and income. Europe rose to world dominance through the Industrial Revolution, innovations in transport and communications, and the ideology and practice of colonialism, during which the developing countries suffered dramatic relative losses. Thus, from 1870 to 1950, Asia's per capita income plummeted from 1/2 of West European levels in 1870 to 1/10 by 1950. This nostalgia for imperial revisionism is confined to the Western countries. Asia's economic output, industrialization, and trade have been on the rebound since, and the transfer of global wealth and power from the north to the south is historically unprecedented in speed and scale, according to both the US National Intelligence Council in 2008 and the UNDP's Human Development Report last year. As part of the shifting global order, US power and wealth have waned, but it remains the most influential international and the only global actor. Japan continues its slow decline. Russia seems to be marking time. Europe's material reach is shorter than its normative grasp. India is starting to recapture world interest, but its capacity to look every opportunity firmly in the eye, turn around, and walk off resolutely in the opposite direction should never be underestimated. And the real winner is China, with an ascendant economy, growing poise, and expanding soft power assets. To turn a familiar phrase around, international politics, I argue, is a struggle for normative ascendancy, the establishment and maintenance of the dominant normative architecture of international order, created and maintained by the interplay of power, ideas, and values. Athens sternly admonished Milos that questions of right and justice apply only to relations among equals in power, while for others, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Subsequent history has modified the thesis with a steady reduction in societal, national, and international violence, from the hunter-gatherer civilizations to modern times, based on empathy, self-control, reason, and moral sense, as Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Human Nature. That is, over the centuries, the pendulum of human behavior has swung surely, albeit slowly and in a jagged rather than linear trajectory, from the pure power towards the normative end of the arc of history. Now, of course, in every era, great powers have a disproportionate ability to influence the prevailing norms and laws also. Just as in domestic systems, even if every citizen has the same one vote, the social elite has much greater access to the political process for writing the rules to govern society. Over the last few centuries, Western ideas and values have found expression as universal norms and been embedded in the dominant institutions of global governance, not necessarily because they are intrinsically superior, but more importantly, behind battleships, missiles, and tanks. That being the case, what are the implications of the emerging polycentric order for the international normative architecture? After leaving office, Bill Clinton said in 2002 that as the top dog in the world, the US faced a fundamental choice. It could make every effort to stay top dog, or it could use its unchallengeable dominance to create a world in which it was comfortable living after it was no longer top dog. The evidence suggests that Washington chose the first option through a military doctrine based on overwhelming force and global strike capability that would deny any adversary the ability to resist US firepower. But a wise Washington would have chosen the second course, to build legal frameworks and political institutions of cooperation, from Eastern Europe through the Middle East to Asia Pacific. The BRICS leaders held their 6th annual meeting in July in Fortaleza, Brazil. The major deliverable from the summit was economic inform and content, but its primary motivation, significance, and also built-in limitations, I believe, are mainly geopolitical. Recall that the term itself was coined by Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs in 2001 as a shorthand proxy to describe the shift in market power and geopolitical clout from the developed economies of the G7 towards the large and populous emerging market economies. So BRICS uniquely is not the product of diplomatic negotiations based on shared political values or even common economic interests. It comprises those emerging powers whose rapidly growing economies, substantial populations, military capabilities, and expanding diplomatic reach translate into rising power profiles. As you'll know, its members make up approximately 40% of world population, 20% of GDP, 15% of world trade, but importantly, account for 2/3 of world growth. They enjoy competitive edges in different areas, from abundant natural resources to strengths in manufacturing, IT, and biotechnology. The BRICS pose a challenge to the US-dominated global architecture comprising the United Nations, World Bank, and IMF trinity. On the eve of the first summit in Russia in 2009, Brazil's President Lula da Silva wrote of broken paradigms and flailing multilateral institutions. On the eve of this past weekend's G20 in Brisbane, China's ambassador to Australia wrote that today the emerging economies have, quote, a greater share in the global economy, but a smaller voice and less representation in its governance. These deficiencies have eroded the legitimacy and credibility of the international institutions and fostered mistrust between the global North and South. But can the BRICS morph from a countervailing economic grouping to a powerful political alternatives? Or is BRICS a construct of the social media-driven marketplace of ideas, an attention-grabbing glib phrase in which speed is a substitute for and trumps quality and depth of analysis? On issues with shared interests and views, the BRICS can exert more leverage in combination than separately. Their natural constituency is the Global South, and the BRICS have the ability and will to represent the interests of developing countries on those issues where the global North-South division is salient. Many developing countries remain worried that the forces of globalization impinge adversely on their economic sovereignty, cultural integrity, and social stability. Interdependence among unequals can mean the dependence of some on international markets that function under the dominance of others in norm setting and rule enforcement. Now, of course, the BRICS are anything but representative of the typical developing country in terms of size, area, power, economic weight, interests, bureaucratic, legal, and scientific capacity, and resources. But what they can do and have done is to reflect and represent the interests and priorities of most developing countries and leverage their atypical attributes of market power and geopolitical clout to negotiate with the developed countries on many global challenges. The BRICS share concerns about the financial and geopolitical dominance of the US-led West and support a rebalancing of the current global trade and financial system to better reflect developing country interests. They can give voice to Southern concerns on new rules for healthcare, pharmaceuticals, intellectual property rights, etc. Most developing countries view environmental, labor, and human rights standards as disguised non-tariff barriers to protect uncompetitive Western agricultural and manufacturing sectors. On intellectual property, whether it be with respect to generic life-saving drugs, seeds for agriculture, or traditional medicine, they can team up to take on the big lobbying power of big pharma and global agribusiness to robustly protect the rights of poor people to affordable medicines, of poor farmers to affordable seeds, and of indigenous peoples to retain ownership of their traditional knowledge. And may I remind you that India has had a very successful program of digitization of traditional knowledge, and it's extending to other countries as well, not just to India, other countries from the South. The biggest common interest of the BRICS is in global economic governance. In the emerging new global balance of power, the old global political imbalances need to be readjusted to realign with the new global economic imbalances. There's an unsustainable disconnect between the distribution of decision-making authority in the existing international financial institutions and the realignment of economic power equations in the real world. The BRICS are at the forefront of demanding changes to the institutions and rules regulating the global economic order including greater voice and vote in writing the rules and designing and controlling the institutions. They profess a shared vision of inclusive global growth and the rapid socio-economic transformation of their own nations, in which no village is left behind. They come to the global governance table with a mutually reinforcing sense of historical grievances and claims to represent the interests of all developing countries. They share a commitment to state sovereignty and non-intervention, and they proclaim the need for a rules-based, stable, and predictable world order that respects the diversity of political systems and stages of development. The BRICS call for more responsive, flexible, and rapid financing to low-income countries to help them ward off the contagion effects of the global financial crisis and shore up their national development objectives. They also call for reforming the international monetary system to consider diversifying beyond the dollar as the de facto global currency and to give increased voice and vote on issues of global finance to developing countries. The G20 had tried to redress the IMF's democratic deficit by agreeing in 2009 to a 5% quota shift from developed to developing countries, which would have raised the latter's share to 48%. This proposal has languished in the US Congress for 5 years and counting, effectively also sabotaging the planned further review and revisions of quotas that was to have begun in January last year. At the 4th BRICS summit in Delhi in 2012, criticism of the voting formula, funding priorities, and executive directorship of the IMF and World Bank reflected both frustrations at how they are run and growing self-confidence in their own roles as responsible stakeholder managers of the system of global economic governance. President Lula said bluntly that the global financial crisis was created by white men with blue eyes. At last year's Durban summit, South Africa's finance minister, Pravin Gordhan, remarked that the roots of the World Bank and the IMF still lie in post-1945 equations. At Fortaleza this July, the 5 leaders reached consensus on the name, objectives, functions, capital subscription size, distribution among the member countries, governance structure, and operational mechanisms. The new development bank will be headquartered in Shanghai with a Johannesburg-based Africa Regional Center. Its first president will be Indian. The 5 agreed to equal shareholding. The bank is to be capitalized initially at $50 billion and subsequently double that amount, with each country contributing $10 billion over the next 7 to 8 years. In addition, there will be an emergency reserve pool called the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, also with $100 billion capital, of which $41 billion will come from China, 18 each from Brazil, India, and Russia, and $5 billion from South Africa. The purpose will be to help developing countries avoid short-term liquidity pressure, strengthen the global financial safety net, complement existing international arrangements, and foster more cooperation among the BRICS. The BRICS Bank is bound to create competition for the World Bank and similar regional funds like the Asian Development Bank. The World Bank's numerous critics are quick to charge that the institution has failed to lift any country out of poverty and instead has generally deepened poverty and created dependency. Only foreign creditors have done well from its projects. This was followed with a memorandum of understanding signed in Beijing on 24th October by 21 countries, including Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka from South Asia, and all ASEAN countries bar Indonesia from Southeast Asia, but with Australia, Japan, and South Korea choosing to stay aloof, for a new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The AIIB will have its headquarters in Beijing and an initial capitalization of $50 billion. The US has raised concerns about the bank's governance, environmental standards, and debt sustainability. John Kerry was reported to have lobbied Australia's Prime Minister Tony Abbott directly against joining the AIIB as a founding member, with the opportunity to shape its evolution from the beginning. The economic ministers in Australia's cabinet were in favour of joining. The foreign minister and the Cabinet Security Committee voted against. Tony Abbott changed his mind. In other words, it was a good example of geopolitics trumping economics, even by Australia. The one other thing to note in this, of course, is you note the inaugural precedents and the locations of these banks. And remember the stranglehold that the Europeans, the Americans, and the Japanese have on the IMF, World Bank, and ADB presidency. So it's more than mere symbolism that we're looking at. On 1st August this year, the Financial Times noted, quote, shifts in global economic power suggest that changes in institutional power may be inevitable. If non-Western nations decide that the West is abusing its institutional power by, for example, bugging internet traffic, imposing arbitrary economic sanctions, or abusing the courts, they will feel much more motivated to set up alternative institutions and to redirect the wiring of the global governance system so that it no longer runs through the West, unquote. The West can best preserve its privileged position, the FT cautioned, by protecting a reputation for fair dealing, robust institutions, and the rule of law. Now let me talk a little bit about that rule of law, because at least 3 of the key BRICS countries have run into problems on the rule of law with Washington. At West Point on 28th May, President Obama insisted, quote, the United States will use military force unilaterally if necessary when our core interests demand it, unquote. In his speech to the General Assembly on 24th September, Obama demanded that, quote, all of us, big nations and small, must meet our responsibility to observe and enforce international norms, unquote. The 2 statements, less than 5 months apart, are not compatible. The use of force is legally permissible only in self-defense against armed attack or when authorized by the United Nations. Therefore, no country that reserves the right to use military force unilaterally can claim to be committed to obeying global norms. Exceptionalism as belief in a uniquely virtuous republic with a moral mission to promote life, liberty, and happiness in the rest of the world is hardwired into US national identity and will likely endure. Exceptionalism as policy was dependent on the unipolar moment of full-spectrum dominance and is fatally undermined by the transformation into a polycentric global order, of which groupings like the BRICS and the G20 are both symbolic and substantive expressions. Washington has wandered into the realm of policy incoherence by attempting to enforce the second part of Obama's UN statement, international norms on 3 rising powers, while violating the same norms itself. The normative discordance is rooted in the foreign policy exceptionalism practiced by Bush that has been continued in essence by the Obama administration, if in a softer international accent. But US capacity to sustain such double standards is steadily eroding as its hegemony declines. The failure to address the discrepancy will damage both US interests and the global normative order and could provoke an unwanted conflict. Washington's arbitrary and selective efforts to enforce the rule of law is indeed stimulating the search for alternative institution designs by key rising powers. Says a German analyst, quote, the goals of the emerging countries is clear, to change the global order with the United States as the hegemonic power, unquote. Washington's recent attempts to browbeat China, India, and Russia with respect to cyber espionage, maritime territorial disputes, domestic US visa and labor laws, international human rights law, and respect for the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, all within 6 months of one another, fail the rule of law test, defined, quote, as a principle of governance in which all are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, from Kofi Annan's report in 2004. As with national and global surveillance, it seems to me that the Americans have fallen into the trap of interfering anywhere and everywhere, not because it is right in principle, or serves a coherent strategic purpose, but because they can, insensitive and indifferent to how threatening or offensive their actions are to others. Apropos of the Million Dialogue I quoted, the West is losing its ability to impose its will, policy preferences, values, and double standards on the rest, who are demanding their rightful due in setting the standards, writing the rules, and designing and controlling the institutions of global governance to ensure compliance. Now, interestingly, while Americans see their policy as springing from universal idealism, many others perceive it as rooted in sanctimonious arrogance. In an interesting and important Chatham House study of elite perceptions published earlier this year, in contrast to Europeans who emphasized America's historical moral leadership, the United States is viewed by many Asian elites as hypocritical, overbearing, arrogant, and disinterested in others' interests, aggressively pushing its own policy priorities instead. This is Asian elites, a totally different perception of US international leadership from European elites, which you would not get from reading the Western press. I've been watching, not surprisingly, the G20 coverage in the international media while I've been traveling. And repeatedly they have said Putin encountered international pressure, international resistance, international rebuke. Nor have they specified which these countries are. Is there a single non-Western country that spoke up on that issue against Putin? Possibly, but I don't know. But this tendency to conflate the international community into the Euro-Atlantic community is increasingly dangerous as well as obsolete. This gap in elite perceptions. Remember, this is the elite. I'm not talking general public. This gap in elite perceptions, I think, is a really worrying sign that the West is losing the hearts and minds of the rest in general and going apart from them. This disconnect between words and deeds leads the United States into trouble abroad and produces foreign policy outcomes that can politely be described as an incoherent mess. When Egypt's first freely elected president was deposed by the military after mass protests last year, John Kerry said the army was restoring democracy. When the Thai military took power through a coup in May this year, also after sustained mass demonstrations and political instability, Kerry insisted there was no justification for this military coup, and US military assistance was suspended until all political detainees are released and fresh elections held. In Ukraine, the West supported street mobs who ousted the elected pro-Russian president and installed a pro-Western government instead. The post-Cold War era of unipolar ascendancy tempted Washington into adopting such discrepant policies and also enabled it to get away with the normative dissonance. That era has passed, and America's imperium is rapidly fading. Either the US must dial back its hostile criticisms of other countries' departures from global norms and international law, backed by threats of diplomatic censure and economic sanctions, and hints of military force if ill-defined or carelessly drawn red lines are crossed. Or else, the US must bridge the wide reality-rhetoric gap between its own pronouncements and actions. With respect to China, on 19th May, Attorney General Holder announced a grand jury had laid cyber espionage charges against 5 Chinese army officers. Beijing denounced the charges as hypocritical. Quote, "The US's deceitful nature and its practice of double standards when it comes to cybersecurity have long been exposed, from the WikiLeaks incident to the Edward Snowden affair," unquote. Because of the global scale of its surveillance program, the US forfeited the sympathy of most other countries on the issue, including Brazil, another BRICS country. Angered by revelations that in addition to citizens being spied on, her personal phone calls and emails had been intercepted by the NSA, President Dilma lambasted US surveillance as a violation of international law and a totally unacceptable infringement of Brazil's sovereignty, and she became the first leader to cancel a state dinner to be hosted by the US president in her honor. Last year, Manila took Beijing to international arbitration over their South China Sea dispute. Stephanie Klein-Albrandt, who is now with the US Institute of Peace, but she used to head International Crisis Group in Beijing for many years, comments that, having studied how US hegemonic behavior blatantly violates international law when it's in its interest, China concluded this is what first-class powers do. With India, Kissinger notes that the most fundamental problem of politics is not the control of wickedness, but the limitation of righteousness. Well, you've got 2 deeply self-righteous countries in India and the US, and that more than anything else explains the history of their difficult relationship for decades. Kissinger went on to say that while punishment of the wicked is relatively simple, to restrain the exercise of righteous power is more difficult. India's Deputy Consul General in New York, Devyani Khobragare, was arrested and strip searched on 12 December last year for alleged violations of US visa and labor laws in connection with her maid. The case involved a contract signed in India between 2 Indian citizens with the government of India as an interested third party, because the maid actually traveled to the US on an official passport. This case was already before India's courts, and US authorities inserted US legal jurisdiction over India's judiciary. As a result, the affair threw up 3 legal questions, all 3 being challenging. Should international law, namely the Vienna Conventions, prevail over domestic law? Which countries' labor laws have priority in multiple jurisdictions? And which country's judicial process should have primacy? The US muscularly shields its diplomats, even when they kill, as with Joshua Wald in Kenya last year and Raymond Davis in Pakistan in 2011. Then Senator Kerry went to Pakistan in 2011 and said, quote, "This case does not belong in the court because Davis has diplomatic immunity," unquote. President Obama insisted on diplomatic immunity for Davis, but stayed studiously silent on Khobragare, as did now Secretary of State Kerry. A bitterly angry India transferred Khobragare to its UN mission, which got her full diplomatic status, and then brought her back to New Delhi, where she remains on active duty. India withdrew courtesies beyond the strict requirements of the Vienna Conventions that had been extended previously to US diplomats and consular officials in India. Says Kishore Mahbubani, among Asia's most prominent public intellectuals, quote, "Virtually every other government in the world was quietly cheering on the Indian government as it insisted on total reciprocity in the treatment of Indian and American officials," unquote. The issue resonated with most Indian diplomats who take their own domestic staff on foreign postings. Almost the entire elite Indian Foreign Service, the permanent custodian of India's permanent interests, was antagonized in a country where the bureaucracy is more powerful than in Western democracies. The incident touched a raw nerve in Hindu society. an analog of rape as power, stripping a woman naked in public, it is a ritual humiliation and a common form of asserting control and exercising power by the upper castes in order to put the lower castes and outcasts in their allotted place in the social order. And Cobra Gare belongs to the lower castes. As a digression, may I point out that if you read the dominant Western media, at least in the English language, you would have absolutely no idea of the reasons for, or even the fact of the depth of Indian anger, both in society and in government, because all you got was the American point of view. And I covered a lot of the mainstream media. There's not one article that presented the Indian case on this. Not one. Several that attacked India. And this, in a country, by the way, where, as in most other countries, the instinctive sympathy is for the laborer and the manual worker and the lower wing. But in this one, Indians looked at the facts and concluded that the maid had gamed the US system in order to get herself and her family migrated into the US at government cost, at US government cost. Almost immediately, Washington confronted its next India headache. As someone who had been refused a US visa for almost a decade became India's prime minister. This was a spectacular own goal from the Bush administration, the administration that endorsed torture as official policy, was responsible for an illegal war of aggression that caused the death and displacement of millions of Iraqi Muslims. It's difficult to see how Gujarat under Modi was more intolerant of minority religions than Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, or Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who was honored in Washington by two presidents, the same two who kept Modi out. If again you followed the G20 in Brisbane, of the 20 leaders and others, CEOs of international organizations, the only one who has any claim today to having rock star status is Modi. Again, you would have absolutely no idea of why Indians voted for him, with the same sense of excitement and hope for change that characterized Obama's first election. And if the Western media, if the English-speaking media cannot get its assessment of an open democratic society like India right, if you rely on that for your understanding of China and Russia and Brazil, you will be fundamentally misled about the politics in these countries. And that is happening. Hence the point about the elite perceptions, and that does worry me greatly. After the election, Washington began a diplomatic minuet of reaching out to the previously untouchable Modi. But consistent with the failure to prosecute the torturers and the legal enablers from the Bush administration, no official will be held accountable for this grave error of judgment. With Russia, in the dominant Western narrative, Ukraine's President Yanukovych was removed in a genuinely popular revolution. Russia annexed Crimea out of pique and in pursuit of Putin's long-standing ambition to resurrect something like the old Soviet Union. Next up would be Eastern Ukraine, with its largely Russian-speaking and Eastern-oriented population, and then perhaps the Baltic states and even Poland. But Russia saw Yanukovych's departure as a result of an illegal coup, orchestrated by dangerous right-wing nationalist elements and supported by interfering European and US officials, driven by the goal to claim Ukraine and the West at Russia's expense. Now, looking at this from the outside, again, it seems to me that the US and European policies on Ukraine are riddled with double standards normatively and are also strategically challenged. In a jaw-dropping interview on 2nd March, Kerry declared that in the 21st century, you cannot just invade countries on a completely trumped-up pretext. Think Iraq 2003. Think Cuban Missile Crisis 62. Think Council of Prudence on Taiwan in not provoking Beijing by any unilateral declaration of independence. Most importantly, think Kosovo 1999. From Russia's perspective, the West's policies after the end of the Cold War intentionally sought to diminish, weaken, and provoke Russia in its immediate vicinity. As NATO's expansion crept ever closer to Russia's heartland, Moscow was going to feel cornered and push back someday, somewhere. Ukraine this year proved to be the place and the time. Let me remind you, NATO includes Germany and France. In terms of historical trauma, think of the invasions of Russia by Napoleon and by Hitler. Undertaken with little strategic hindsight or foresight, NATO's numerical, territorial, and mission creep progressively alienated Russia, encouraged recklessness by some East European states, and put NATO credibility on the line without making it stronger. I just don't see how any government in Moscow could tolerate the loss of Crimea and the headquarters of its Baltic fleet. It's not a question of Putin, it's a question of strategic interests. If Russia is no longer a great power, Russia will pay the price for this confrontation in due course. If Russia still is a great power, we will pay the price for having unnecessarily provoked it. Not to mention the fact that we have pushed Russia and China together once again in a reversal of the genius of the Kissinger-Nixon driving a wedge policy between Russia and China. Speaking at the Waldai Club on 24th October, by coincidence the same day as you had the new bank signed in Beijing, Putin delivered an extraordinarily tough diatribe against Washington, insisting that US policies, not Russia, had torn apart the existing rules of global order and brought chaos and instability. The Ukraine crisis was the result of a coup d'etat carried out with the support of Western powers. They were also short-sighted in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, such that Americans, quote, are constantly fighting the consequences of their own policies, throw all their effort into addressing the risks they themselves have created, and pay an ever greater price, unquote. Think the Islamic State in Iraq. It's not a bad description of that thing. The final section, very quickly, lack of unity, coherence, and focus. How important is that? Because the BRICS are far from homogeneous in interests, values, and policy preferences, which leaves them open to the comment that the BRICS lack the necessary cement to bind them together. They are totally different countries with separate histories, contexts, political and economic systems, needs, opportunities, and even development trajectories. They are riven with rivalries over borders, resources, and status. While strong enough to veto Western action, they lack the political clout and economic muscle to remake the status quo. Nor do they always act as a concerted bloc within other institutional settings. On some issues, the BRICS have common interests with one another, but on others, they compete against one another and collaborate with selected Western powers. In all, domestic politics and problems trump club solidarity. Nonetheless, I think several BRICS have an accumulating list of irritants in relations with Washington. And all five have a strong vested interest in protecting strategic autonomy vis-à-vis the US in global affairs. So the most potent source of BRICS cohesion is geopolitical. The common interest in checking US Western power and imperialist impulses by leveraging collaboration with the other non-Western powers. The West's addiction to sanctions, for example, provides a powerful incentive to other countries like the BRICS to develop long-term alternative financial institutions for parking their money and moving them internationally. Seamus Mill of The Guardian comments, quote, Russia's counterweight to US imperial expansion is welcomed from China to Brazil, unquote. According to India's former Foreign Secretary, Kanwal Sibal, writing in March this year, quote, the West's bullying instincts based on unbridled self-righteousness and arrogance must be countered by the rising countries by building their own political, economic, and security networks. This is a former foreign secretary of India. Putin's Valdai Club 40-minute initial address was followed by an hour-long Q&A with the assembled journalists and academics. If you read that, and I think it is worth reading, he seems to signal this end of a search for a mutually beneficial Russia-US partnership in which Moscow cedes a global leadership role to the US in return for a privileged Russian role in Eurasia. Instead, Russia will seek to forming coalitions with others so that collectively they can circumscribe and ring-fence the exercise of US economic and geopolitical power. In the reimagined global order, the various BRICS countries will be able to sustain their preferred policies against concerted Western pressure. And may I remind you that at the G20 summit in Brisbane, the BRICS did have a side meeting amongst themselves as well. And I close with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Thakur, for that very insightful and interesting presentation. Now we're going to invite up NUPI's own Dr. Cedric de Koning for a discussion, and after that, a short round of Q&A.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much, Ramesh, and thank you very much, Ilana. With Professor Thakur here speaking on this topic, we thought it's an opportune moment to share with you a summary of a book that we have recently published on the BRICS and coexistence. And there's a sample copy and some information about the book over there. But with academic books these days, one needs a loan from the Development Bank if you want to buy one. So I thought I'll rather just give you a bit of a summary, since it's probably unlikely that many of you would invest. But we do have the book here in the library if you're interested. But I think many of the themes that Ramesh has touched on is very relevant in terms of what we've tried to also address in the book. We've emphasized that the BRICS are trying to share a common vision of a global future where the rules prevent any one state or an alliance of states from dominating the international system. And we, the editors of the book, have chosen to refer to this approach to global governance as a strategy of coexistence. And the concept has a history in the non-aligned movement and in the foreign policies of China, India, and Russia, and to some degree Brazil, and to some degree the Ubuntu philosophy in South Africa. And in the book we have chapters on the foreign policy of each of these countries measured against this framing of coexistence. But we also have a chapter in the book about the BRICS as a whole, especially seen against the communiques of the various summits of how the BRICS present themselves together. And this is also where we reflect on this concept of coexistence and the relevance of this concept. And we have defined coexistence as international policy coordination for the purposes of conflict management, which then develops into a system of co-management or co-maintenance of global security issues. And we're saying that although the BRICS is widely understood to be a grouping that has a shared macroeconomic interest, we argue that it would be wrong to take this to mean that the BRICS do not have a political project. And I think, again, this is something that's quite commonly presented, especially in the Western media, to try and minimize our understanding of the BRICS as something purely economic. Firstly, we think it should be recognized that the global economic and financial project of the BRICS has a political aim, namely to redress global inequality at the level of the international political economy. But secondly, the BRICS also has a direct political project that is aimed at transforming the way the international system is governed. From the BRICS perspective, I think as Ramesh has very well argued, the current global order is controlled and manipulated by the developed countries to serve their own interest. And therefore, in response, the BRICS articulate a vision of a new global order that is more democratic, just, fair, and representative, and in which all countries participate equally. Thus, a policy to try to prevent hegemony of one or an alliance of state in response to what they perceive as the current state of affairs. Now, this, of course, perhaps is most clearly articulated in the context of intervention. And we've seen in the context of the Libyan and Syria's interventions that the BRICS position has been that the independence, sovereignty, unity, and integrity of each nation should be respected and upheld, and that all the parties to a conflict or dispute should resolve their differences through peaceful means and dialogue. And so the BRICS countries reject the imposition of solutions with force from the outside. For them, self-determination means that each society has the right to make its own decisions regarding how it is ruled. And in the case of Libya and Syria, the BRICS position was that the international community should support and facilitate negotiations and dialogue among all the factions in these countries, but stop short of taking actions that amount to taking decisions on behalf of the societies in question. So in the Syrian case, for the first time, the BRICS were able to go beyond statements to actually blocking the preferred course of action of the West. And it's interesting in the sense that it shows us that in order for the BRICS to start to change the existing global order, they don't have to become stronger than the West, only strong enough to block the West. In other words, they don't have to become economically and militarily as strong or stronger than the West. They just need to be able to improve their cooperation sufficiently to block the West from manipulating, for instance, the UN Security Council or other fora where these decisions are being made. We describe that the theory of change of the BRICS in pursuing this global order can be described as co-shaping the new global order by, on the one hand, coordinating their engagements in a wide range of international forums so as to maximize their influence, whilst, on the other hand, the BRICS countries are increasing their own inter-BRICS cooperation, including by embarking on their own projects and by creating their own institutions, so that these can both help them to overcome some of the limitations of the international institutions, as well as to further pressurize their international counterparts to reform by way of example and through competition. The one issue that stands out as probably the least developed in the BRICS common position is on Security Council reform. Here, of course, we have a tension between countries like Russia and China that have a veto power and permanent members, and the other BRICS countries that have ambitions to become members of the Security Council. This is one of the issues that are unresolved and still, I would say, a source of tension within the BRICS countries. However, if and when they do resolve this tension, the BRICS countries will have a very influential voice with both 2 permanent members and several others that have credible claims to be represented on the Security Council. One of the reasons why the BRICS may have chosen not to pursue Security Council reform at this stage, and the reform of other global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank more aggressively, why they're not pursuing reform more aggressively in these areas, could be that the BRICS countries are cautious not to pursue their reform agenda at a pace that would destabilize the current global order. This is because their continued rise and influence in the international system is closely interlinked with their position in the global economy. The degree to which they are able to achieve economic growth have a direct influence on their ability to make domestic progress with their own national development agendas. And they will thus be careful to not destabilize world economic growth. Reforming the global system at too rapid a pace is likely to increase uncertainty to a level that may negatively affect the global economy, with, of course, further negative knock-on effects on the global political order. This means that the BRICS are likely to be careful when pushing for reform of institutions like the UN Security Council to ensure that such reforms are undertaken at a pace that does not harm their own short to medium-term interests. Thank you very much. I hope that gave you an introduction to some of the issues we've tried to address in our book on the BRICS and coexistence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cedric. I'll invite you both up to the table for questions. Just taking a quick scan. Great. We have one question to start with in the hall. Mark, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Okay.
Thank
Hi.
you.
Thank you very much. Mark Lantain here at NUPI. Just two quick questions. First of all, among some of the events which you talked about over the past few weeks, the AIIB and the various new BRICS institutions, two other events are pretty noteworthy. First of all, today the free trade agreement between China and Australia was formally announced. I'm looking forward to reading it. And there's also a bit of a debate about a free trade agreement of the Asia-Pacific, which may act as a kind of counterweight to the Trans-Pacific Partnership being touted by the United States. With all this happening, do you see competition among economic institutions, soft balancing, if you will, kind of playing a much stronger role when we look at, for example, the BRICS versus the West in terms of diplomatic maneuvering? The other question is, your comments on Crimea, very interesting. The agreement that was signed, memorandum in Budapest, 1994, which specifically guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity. Russia at that time signed the agreement and did not appear to ask for any particular concessions concerning Crimea beyond what was already been given. And yet 20 years after the fact, the memorandum was seemingly torn up with the idea that, yes, Crimea always has been a major priority for the Russian military. So why the sudden change over 20 years? Thank you.
On the first one, I think there are two dimensions to all the free trade agreements and all the banks that are being set up as well. One is the economic interests, and that's very clear. For the infrastructure bank, Asia's infrastructure needs will be huge. I think it's something like $1 trillion a year. The concerns that Washington expresses, well, it's the other side of that is most recipient countries don't like the conditionalities and they just want to get on with developing projects that they choose rather than projects that are imposed with conditions by outsiders. But at the same time, there is also no doubt in my mind that part of the motivation behind the initiatives and part of the resistance is that these are key vehicles for exercising strategic influence. And that's where the geopolitics part comes in as well. I don't think you can separate that. Now, of course, for Australia, we are in a particular position in that our major trade partner is China, but our primary security relationship is with the United States. It's a potential tension. Some of the tensions have been brought to the front. Some developments and some statements in the developments in the US-Australia relationship, statements by Australian leaders have deeply antagonized and offended Beijing, and they've made their displeasure pretty plain as well. And they're starting to do that much more bluntly than they used to. But it's something that Australia is going to have to work through, and there is, if you follow Australian debates at all, there is an active debate on whether we've gone too far in aligning with the Americans and whether effectively Australia's policy now has been outsourced to Washington. That was on the fringes before. That element has always been there. But that argument used to be the fringe element before. Now it's progressively coming more central, mainstream. When you have former Conservative Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser saying that, as was the former Deputy Secretary of Defense Hugh White arguing that, it reflects a certain change in the Australian perception. So that is something that we are going to have to work through. On the Crimean issue, I think there's a few things. I mean, from a Russian perspective, effectively the answer would be that the world we signed on to in 1994, before the terms on which we agreed, you had a rare example in history of the defeated power agreeing to the terms, acquiescing to the terms of its defeat. But they thought they did so on certain understandings that were progressively abandoned. It's clear, and if you look at what Lavrov has been saying, if you look at what Putin has been saying, as well as a series of other Russian commentators, they clearly believe they had an agreement that in order to permit Germany to be reunited and a reunified Germany to be part of NATO and withdraw Soviet troops or Russian troops after the end of the Cold War, NATO would not expand any further. If you look at the article in Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago by Schifrinson or some such name, it's very interesting. This was James Baker in conversation with Gorbachev and his aides. It would appear that when Baker comes back to Washington, the Bush administration refuses to sign off on it, but did not communicate that disagreement to Moscow. So that may be the source of the miscommunication or misperception. But that's one strand of that. And if you look at the number of times they all bring up Kosovo in 1999 now, clearly that was a deeply, deeply scarring experience that is seared into their memory now as a formative thing. Then I think they were shocked by the overthrow of a rough, undoubtedly, almost certainly corrupt guy, but nonetheless elected president. And no more rougher and no more corrupt than the alternating presidents. And for example, when I have these conversations with Indian colleagues, and they say, well, you know, why is all this happening? And I say, well, imagine an anti-New Delhi federal government demonstration somewhere in Kashmir, and imagining an American senator coming and standing with the protesters, an American State Department official. What do you think would the reaction be of the Indian government? So those sorts of provocations, and then the sheer foolishness of starting to immediately to strip away the rights of the Russian-speaking minority after you have your new government in terms of language and other rights. I think even if they hadn't done the last part, I think they could have found some window of mutual compromise. But the series of steps that were taken, and then, as I said, if you know, we underestimate what lessons a lot of other countries have drawn from the fate of Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. And the bluntest statement of this position was actually by one of the Iranian leaders. It might have been the Ayatollah. I think it was actually Khamenei. If you are going to have to confront the United States as Russia, you're better off when you still have Sevastopol than after you've lost it. You will still lose. You will still be defeated. But the cost to the United States will be a bit higher than if you're militarily weakened even more. So if you look at it from, as I said, from their point of view, the strategic threat of the loss of Crimea overcomes everything else. But normatively, the counter is, why deny the opportunity for self-determination to the Crimea? If that is what you put, and of course no Western government has claimed that. No Western government has claimed, well, the way to resolve it is to let's have a, you know, the referendum they had was a sham referendum. But I don't think anyone doubts that if we had a genuine referendum, the outcome would still be the same. So people who are transferred from Russia to Ukraine without their consent being ascertained, and have made very clear that they always wanted to be part of Russia, and with the changes in Kiev, they'd rather tie with Russia, it becomes very difficult to take any position that resonates with the Russians. And the interesting thing with the other developing countries, including the other BRICS, of course, is with a strong emphasis on territorial integrity and sovereignty and opposition to secession, they still have found a measure of understanding because of the provocations at the sea that were inflicted on Russia. And that's why they haven't been that critical of the Russian action. So there is that element that you know, new facts on the ground, if you like. And arguably, to be fair to the Americans as well, that's what they thought as well, that they had agreed maybe to a deal with the Russians on a certain basis, but things had changed around completely. It was a new situation. The people of these countries want one by one to have the security relationship and the economic relationship with Europe and NATO. They fear Russia. There's good reasons historically and presently and prospectively. So why shouldn't they have the right? So there is that misunderstanding. And that's why I said what I did during my talk, that in the end, it will boil down to, is Russia still a great power or not? If it is, you don't go treat. Nepal just doesn't have the freedom strategically to be able to do what it wants because it is wedged between India and China. That is the fate of some countries when they're caught between great powers. Now, if it's not a great power, it's acting like a great power, it will pay the price. If it is, we are treating it as if it's not, we'll pay the price.
Collect the next few questions from Arna, and then the gentleman there, and then the gentleman in front.
So I'm Arne Melchior from the International Economics Group at NUPI. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I think this message about this common sense of anger and is very important to observe in the West. My question is related to this this commonality of the BRICS and this idea of BRICS as a kind of leadership for the G77 or the third world or the South. Because the South was gone 15 years ago, in a sense, because you had a long period of misery in many African countries. You had the emerging powers rising with better growth, etc. So this old sense of commonality was a bit dissolved. But then you had this last decade after the year 2000, after the turn of the century, with high commodity prices. You had new growth in Africa. Many small countries that had been lagging behind for a couple of decades were now kind of growing again. And then, of course, you had the BRICS and the emerging countries. So my question is whether the kind of moral force of the BRICS is sustained because of this growth era. So what will happen when the commodity prices go down? What will happen when Russia cannot buy so many goods from Asia anymore? Because after 2000, there's been a massive switch in Russian behavior in world markets. So they are replacing their purchases from the neighbors with purchases from Asia. And of course, there has been fast growth in India. In China, it's expected to be a bit lower in China. In India, they are really struggling now. For example, you read in the Economic Times a couple of days ago that Modi's last initiative is a concerted action to see how can imports from China be dampened. Because India has a massive trade deficit with China growing, which is a kind of economic problem. Yeah, so my question is, can this kind of commonality and common self-understanding among the BRICS and BRICS as a leadership be sustained if you have harder economic times?
Thank you. We'll take the next question. Here, Liv. Thanks.
Tore Nederbø from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I just wanted to have a clarification from Professor Thakur. Could you please repeat and explain what you said with reference to Putin's description of the US behavior in international politics? Did you compare or use that quotation to compare US foreign policy to what the IS is doing in Iraq?
Thank you, and then we'll take the last question for today. The gentleman in the gray fleece here in front.
Thank you. I'm Bjørn Skogmo. I also have a background from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's always interesting to listen to you, Ramesh. So thank you for coming back to Norway to share your insights with us. You spent a lot of time criticizing the coherence or the incoherence of US policies and also the double standards of both the US and the West. Unfortunately, this is not a new issue. We have been struggling with this issue for many years, and of course it has not become easier over the time, and I think it would be incorrect also to put all Western countries in that same basket. My question would be more on the wider issue of world economic governance, because you touched upon the need for reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. Unfortunately, this is not a new issue either. It has been with us at least since the 1960s, and it is And I think it's a very legitimate issue for the whole of the global south. The answer now with the establishment of the new BRICS banks is, are we now beginning to see the emergence of a parallel system, not only to the Bretton Woods institutions, but to the wider network of world or global economic governance, leaving aside the issue of the reforms of the Security Council. But there are a network of other multilateral institutions, apart from the Bretton Woods institutions, that are also very much part of the global economic governance issues. I'm thinking about the network within the rest of the UN system, for instance. Do you see this system also weakening, eroding? Because in these parts of the system, the global south has a majority. It can call upon a majority of votes within the rest of the economic system. Is it eroding? Is there an interest among the BRICS also to address the very clear need for reforms even in that part of the system? Because, for instance, if you look at the UN development system, it's clearly in need of reform. But it's been hard to define the interest or commitment of the rest of the BRICS to those parts of the global multilateral system. Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting questions, which of course remind us that change is the constant. We only have a few minutes to address them, and I thought maybe I'd let Cedric, if there's something you want to say first, then we can allow our guest to have the last word and hopefully also address the point of clarification before we conclude in 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I mean, perhaps just very shortly on I think many of those questions. I think it's still unclear or undecided whether the BRICS Bank and the various other actions is actually an attempt to replace the Bretton Woods institutions or the UN institutions. I think it's much more a case of placing pressure, as I indicated, providing competition, urging reform by way of example, by way of pressure. And as the system develops, I think countries, including the BRICS countries, will position themselves and decide how to go forward. But I think it's more a case of multiple systems going forward in a networked way, as opposed to one replacing another.
I actually do have a plane to catch, so I'm going to have to try and keep my comments much briefer than I would like, because they're good questions, they're important questions, and they're also complex questions with lots of nuances. Let me begin with a comment, conscious of the city I'm in. I think if you did a poll around the world, probably the person whose name would be most commonly associated with peace in the last century would be Mahatma Gandhi, who most famously never got a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, is that a reflection on Gandhi or on the peace committee? The reason I start with that is, if your structures do not reflect the real world, it's progressively the structures that lose legitimacy and effectiveness. And that is happening. There's corrective measures with parallels and hope that these are complementary rather than substitutes at the moment, economic institutions of governance. But the same comment applies to the security institutions as well. The longer this disconnect persists, the less legitimate. To reverse the language of the Kosovo Commission, Security Council resolutions will remain legal, but they will progressively be seen as more and more illegitimate because it's so out of touch with reality. So that risk is there. You're right about double standards, that's nothing new. I will go even further. Double standards is characteristic of all countries, or at least policy inconsistency characterizes every country. If you went through the 193 UN member states, I doubt that even one would survive a rigorous test of absolutely consistent foreign policy. So that's not a problem. But the US, and you're right, parts of the West, not all the West, but just as the developing countries are not unified bloc either. But they have been different from the others in trying to export and impose their standards and their values and enforce it, even if they cannot meet all the standards themselves. That has set them apart. And more importantly, in terms of what's happening now as opposed to the previous things. And of course, you know, the big issue items on which double standards has been alleged for decades. One, Palestinian issue, as you will know better than me with your background, and two, the nuclear issue with the NPT. So that's always been there. The difference is, and that's part of my argument, that the West is losing its ability to get away with double standards. And the rest are articulating, pushing back, and developing institutions and developing policies. Where do you think Modi sits on the question of sanctions against Putin, having been ostracized by the United States and Europe? Not by Australia, by the way. He did come to Australia in 2004. And while he was ostracized, he was welcomed by China and Japan. Where do you think his instincts and sympathies will lie on this? So that's the situation. And this goes back to the first question. I think if the BRICS collectively, or any one of the key countries individually, lose their economic way, then I think their geopolitical clout will also fade. So that's absolutely true. Modi knows that, recognizes that. And his response to China, I don't think will be to go down the protectionist route. It will be to compete and outperform against China. That's his philosophy, that's his instinct. Make in India, we'll open up our competitiveness, we will reduce barriers, we will reduce tariff barriers, administrative inconveniences, we'll throw out old antiquated laws, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a good way to go. And his key distinction with the previous government is he doesn't go in for subsidies, he doesn't go in for, I'll give you a free blanket every 5 years. He goes and talks to the gold thread weavers in Varanasi, which is now his political constituency, and says, with an emerging middle class that wants to spend money on expensive saris so they can attend weddings, your market is unlimited. What can I do so you are connected to that market? That's his approach. So he does want to do that. But you know, your comment remains true. If they falter economically, if India falters economically, the number of foreign visitors going will diminish, and those who do go will go to Rajghat, pay their lip service to the ancient culture and rich heritage and stuff like that, praise India's culture, and then go again. It will become irrelevant again. So I think that is absolutely spot on. That is a key to the geopolitical clout comes from the market power. The populations will remain large. You think of India with this huge, half the population under 35. If it cannot get its economics right, that becomes a huge social and political instability problem for India. If it does get it right, that's an enormous middle class that will sustain world growth as well. And the Putin statement, if you look at US policy with regard to Assad and IS and Syria in general, I don't think they've actually sat down and done the hard questions. Who is the enemy? Can we prioritize the bad guys? Is Assad preferable to the alternative, which is IS? Are we in a de facto alliance with Assad and with Iran, for that matter, in combating the IS? Are there any moderate factions left in the rebels? We still want to support, aid the moderate rebels, arm them? We know that the arms we give go on to these guys as well. So isn't that sense of, as I said, that's what I meant about strategic coherence. And that's what Putin was saying in his speech, that look, you are having to live with the consequences of your own policies. You went into Iraq and destabilized that. You went into Libya and destabilized that. You have been trying to destabilize Syria. What if the combined cumulative consequences of this is the rise of extremism that is emboldened, that is empowered, that takes your weapons and then turns against you? The same thing that the Americans suffered with the blowback from Afghanistan, the Russians have suffered elsewhere. Again, it's not unique to them. Indians suffered that in Sri Lanka and with regard to the Khalistani Sikh problems as well. But that's the point he was trying to make. And it's very clear that again and again, you destabilize, you don't think through the consequences, and then you have to go in and try to clean up the mess that you didn't make, but someone else made as a result of you breaking what was in existence there already. That's what you're saying, and that's what I was referring to.
Thank you very much. I have a feeling we could discuss much longer than this, but unfortunately we need to conclude the seminar. Thank you to the audience for wonderful questions and to our speakers for very wonderful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ramesh.